Hello, my name is Gabriel Galway, this is Blue, and welcome to The Ugly Goblin. So, today we're celebrating 4,000 subscribers, and so I'm going to do an hour-long workshop on world building. And I'm going to try to cover as many points as I can. Oh my god, she's shedding, so there's so much hair coming off her, and it's making me sneeze. So I'm going to try to cover as many of my bases as I can in terms of world building. World building is this never-ending rabbit hole that you can go down, and it branches off into all these different passageways, and you can go down those as far as you want. But I'm going to just touch on as many bases as I can, and then obviously if you're interested I can go in depth in more of these aspects. Let me know in the comments if you are interested in certain aspects of this talk, and also make sure to subscribe if you enjoy what I'm doing and like this video. Share it with your friends. But without further ado, I'm going to go and hop straight into World Building 101. So this is my From Gods to Goblins, a guide to world building. So we're going to jump straight in and we're going to look at where to begin. So it's quite intimidating when you jump into world building. If you have a world that you want to create, it can be very intimidating. You've got so many beautiful references out there, but it feels like the world's creator, like Matt Mercer, or with the likes of Middle Earth, you feel like its creators can point anywhere on the map and tell you exactly what's there, what the population of that city is, what are the most amount of like elves to dwarves ratio, what's the drama, who lives here, what's the terrain like. All of these things you feel like a world builder can do immediately if you were to point at anywhere on the map. These creators have spent years developing their world. This is my own world. This is Gostar, and I've been developing it for about 10 years. And I feel like I'm in a comfortable place where you could pick anywhere on this map and I could tell you about it. But how do you get here? It takes quite a while to get to this place. And so I'm going to talk you through the steps on how to get a world similar to this one. What I like to compare it to is a painting. If any of you are artists out there, you'll know what I'm talking about. But basically, when you start on a drawing, if you start small, for example, focusing on just the eye, you'll spend hours drawing that eye, drawing the eyelashes, putting all the detail into the iris and then the tear duct and everything. It's a very beautiful eye. You spend about an hour or something drawing it. And then you realize, oh, okay, I've got to draw the eyebrow now, and I've got to draw the nose, and you spend an hour on each of those, and you're like, oh my god, this is going to take forever, and you give up, because there's just too much to do, and everything has to compare to the original detail that you drew, which was the eye. Or, alternatively, what you might find is as you draw that eye and work your way out, you all of a sudden reach the borders of the paper, and you can't push beyond that. You're stuck. And so the rest of the drawing looks strange. It's just this super zoomed in area of the eye and the nose, and that's all that you can fit on the page. So on the flip side of that, if you start really big, you sketch out all of the main details and like the main shapes of the face that you're drawing. You do all these big broad strokes. You map it all out. You do all the broad strokes of the face. So you know that it's going to fit within the page. You know that the framing is going to look nice. It's a good perspective. And then you start to work your way in. You start to add more and more details and refine and render the piece. So eventually you have a whole beautiful face. And that's a great way to work. But what you might find, especially when it comes to world building, is once you do that, once you have your picture, two things. Either it won't have a particular focus because you never focused on one thing, you just did all the broad strokes and now nowhere in particular stands out. Or you'll find it very difficult to choose where to start your story. You're just going to be overwhelmed with options. You've added all of these details, all of these cities and places, and you won't know where to begin your story. It's like scrolling through Netflix and just having way too many choices. So you get like choice paralysis and you just give up. You just turn it off and you go to bed. So both options are good in their own way. However, they can both lead to artist block or writer's block, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to show you how to avoid that and how to get all the way from the start to the finish. So what you do first is you start with your broad strokes. You think of your theme, you think of your setting, and you think of a conflict within your story. And I'll get to all these points soon, but just keep in mind that you want to get the nice broad strokes out first. But don't start refining anything yet. Just get those 3 down. Next, you're going to move on to a very small concept. So you're going to go big and then you're going to go as small as you possibly can. And you're going to try to find the focus of your story. Where in your story has the smallest amount of ripple effects from the main conflict? And I'll get to all that in just a moment. But an example is in The Lord of the Rings. We've got Sauron and his big evil army about to destroy the whole world, destroy all existence, whatever. And then we've got to decide, okay, so where does our story start? So we go as far as we can from the main conflict until we discover a point that is still just barely affected by this conflict in some way. So we go as far away as we can to the furthest ripple from the conflict. And what we find is a single ring slowly corrupting the mind of an older hobbit. And that ring needs to be destroyed in order to destroy this big evil thing. So that's the furthest we travel. And we find this just a small, simple ring in a wonderful, happy town, completely oblivious to all the evil approaching this earth. And there we find Frodo. So our job as a world builder isn't to just create this very elaborate world with all the intricacies and details and everything else, but it's also designing a story and then bridging the gap between that focus, between the story, the hero, your audience's perspective, and the world. And you are slowly developing both of these in tandem with each other until they meet, and they both will bounce off ideas from the other one and help each other grow. So what you might find is as your audience progresses through the story over here, you realize you'll need to add additional things to your world so to accommodate for that story. On the flip side, as you develop your world, you might develop a town or a city or a beautiful landscape that you will then want to add into your story. So like I mentioned before, you want to find your conflict in your broad strokes and then find the smallest ripple effects, the furthest you can get through from your conflict, and figure out what's happening at that point. And that's probably where you want to start your story. It's my own opinion anyway. And when I talk about conflict as well, I don't mean it has to be it doesn't always have to be a world-ending event like Sauron, the Evil Eye, and his army of orcs. It's totally dependent on your setting and your theme. For example, you've got Geographer in Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley is this beautiful, wholesome, cottagecore farming simulator where you work with the community and buy products from the local shops, and so everyone benefits from each other. It's this beautiful ecosystem of sorts where everyone is helping each other out. Then Geographer comes in. It's this cold corporation that's completely isolated from the rest of the community, and everything's much cheaper there. However, paying to Geographer means you're not helping out the old shopkeep in the town, and slowly the soul of the town will be sucked up by this mart if everyone supports it. So entirely dependent on the setting. So when I talk about settings as well, there's a whole bunch of settings out there. You gotta ask yourself, is this a high fantasy setting or a space opera like Saga, which is one of my favorite graphic novels of all time? If you haven't read it, check it out. The artwork is phenomenal. You've got cyberpunk settings out there, or maybe you want to go for a contemporary fantasy, like something along the lines of Ghibli. For example, Ponyo is a beautiful example of contemporary fantasy. Contemporary fantasy is like our own world, but with fantasy elements thrown in. So for example, Ponyo is set in a seaside town, and it's got this beautiful relationship between Ponyo, who's the daughter of basically the ocean, and this little boy. And as we break down Ponyo as well, you realize it's more than just a contemporary fantasy. You know, it's more than just that small seaside town. It's this story of growing up and the wonder of childhood and the relationship between these two kids. Ultimately, it is a coming of age story, and that is the theme. And there are so many themes out there. You gotta ask yourself, is your story a political one? Is it about family? Is it about magic and like exploring magical systems, such as Earthsea, for example? In the Earthsea series, they really explore what magic is, and it's just beautiful. If you haven't read the Earthsea books, they are incredible and you need to watch them. I listen to them all on Audible. This isn't a sponsor, by the way, but it was so nice to do that, and then also maybe Worldbuild or Draw on the side. Such a wonderful time, and I'm sad I got through them all. Also ask yourself, maybe it might be a hero's journey. If it's a hero's journey, and that often fits TTRPGs, especially like Dungeons and Dragons, where the whole journey is just about getting stronger, getting more powerful, facing bigger threats, that kind of thing. It's not quite the hero's journey, I know, but it might be a power fantasy like that. Or quite simply, it might be about gods. It might be some kind of story inspired by Norse mythology or Greek mythology, and maybe you want to follow the story of the gods. You might want to think about a pantheon. So pantheons are just like, there's the Greek pantheon, there's the Norse pantheon. These are the collections of gods that a civilization follows. And so if you want to add gods to your world, I will just get you to ask yourself a few questions. So number one, is the story that you're going to tell a religious one? Is there a focus on religion in your story? Or say you're playing a tabletop game, say you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, do any of your players worship a god? They might be a cleric, are they a paladin, or, you know, in general, just do they worship one god? And is that something that player wants to explore? If the answer is no, then just don't do it. Don't put gods in your game. It's a whole rabbit hole that you can go down, and you don't need them in your world. And you can always add them later if you wish. But if you do want to add gods, this is just my 2 cents in helping you along. Number one, keep it simple. What are some core features of your world? Is death, for example, prominent in your world? And is that something you want to explore? If so, maybe you need a god of death to govern that. Or also, how was your world created? Was it created by one god or many gods? Yeah, exactly. You said it, Blue. So number two, keep it small. So if a god is never mentioned to your audience, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And more gods can always pop up later when you better understand your world and what aspects of it need a god. Point number three, keep it vague as well. The less you show, the more that is left to the imagination and the more mysterious your gods will feel. If you have a hard magic system in your world, throw it out the window for this part and embrace a soft magic system. Also, if you want to know more about gods, if this is interesting to you, I've made a video on how to make gods and add them to your game. So if you want to get a bit more out of this, go check out my other video and then hop back over here when you're done. But I mentioned soft magic systems, and magic systems in general are kind of how otherworldly things work. They are the kind of rules or how typically magic works in your games. And it's usually broken down into hard and soft magic systems. So, for example, hard magic systems are the likes of Avatar, where you've got these people who can bend elements. If you don't know Avatar, you've got different types of elemental benders. You've got air benders, water benders, earth benders, and fire benders. And a whole bunch of other things as well. I won't get into the other types of benders. But essentially, each of these people, if they move in different ways, they can bend certain elements. It's usually something you're born with as well. So that's another rule if you're born a bender typically. Each of these movements that they make are based off of different martial arts. So for example, earthbending is more rigid and hard movements, whereas firebending is very aggressive, waterbending is very graceful, and airbending is very peaceful and kind of defensive, I believe. And so with hard magic systems, for example, in Avatar, You've got certain rules. So a firebender can't bend if they are too cold. So you could put a firebender in a fridge and they can't do anything. Alternatively, you could put a waterbender in the desert and they can't create any water. They can't create water from nothing. However, knowing that rule, you can start thinking logically about how maybe they can bend water, and maybe they can cut open a cactus, for example, and take the water out of it and use that to bend. So that's what hard magic systems are. There are very hard, like distinct rules with how the magic system works. Whereas soft magic systems are the opposite of that. There's no explanation. Magic just happens, and it is mystical and wonderful and often difficult to explain. And when I also talk about magic systems, they don't always have to be magical either. Say you have a cyberpunk world, the magic system for that cyberpunk world could be different augmentations that you add to your body that change it in different ways, like being able to turn your hands into plasma or something like that, and that can be a magic system. It's basically a system that exists for the extraordinary in your story. So going into a little detail about what different magic systems are, you've got soft magic systems, and the pros and cons of that are, the best thing for soft magic systems, I think, are that they feel magical. They feel mystical and wonderful. They feel like magic because there's not someone there pointing out the rules like, how did that work? Oh, that doesn't make any sense. It just happens, or that you can't put a logic to it. And that's kind of what magic is at the end. It's kind of logic defying, in my opinion anyway. And it's also quite a flexible way to tell stories. It's a soft magic system. The cons, however, are, especially if you use it too much, it can feel inconsistent, and it can often feel like there's no weight to anything in your story, especially if you use it too much. Like one fun example are Gandalf's magical birds that come and pick up people, and you're like, well, why didn't the birds just take the hobbits all the way to the mountain? But I suppose maybe there's some other mystical things we don't understand with the birds, but in the end there's no explanation for how these birds work, and that's kind of what's wonderful about them too. However, soft magic systems tend to also allow for very convenient solutions for things. And so just be careful when using magic in a soft way, in a very gentle way, not to do it too much, because otherwise it won't feel magical anymore if you keep using magic. Hard magic systems are typically those that rely on a gimmick, like the Avatar: The Last Airbender relies on airbending. You've got, what's another example? Can you think of an example of a hard magic system? Full Metal Alchemist. There we go. Another example is Full Metal Alchemist. There is very strict rules to how to use alchemy. There's the law of equivalent exchange, which is very cool. Another example of how to use bad hard magic systems is Harry Potter. That's also a hard magic system in its own way, with many, many flaws, and we'll get to those very soon. But the pros to using a magic system are that they are crunchy and satisfying. They add a consistency to your world, and they give it structure and rules that you can base things off of. And when I talk about crunchy and satisfying, when you watch a series that has a really good hard magic system, you're constantly trying to work things out. It's kind of like watching a mystery or murder mystery, kind of trying to solve it as it goes along. You get these bits of information about how that murder took place, and you get all of these different snippets of information, and with those snippets of information you start to piece together the puzzle and the mystery, or also work out how the heroes are going to escape X, Y, or Z. The cons, however, to a hard magic system are that if you don't make it airtight, if you don't think of every kind of possibility within the hard magic system, if you don't lock it down, it can be very easy to unravel. Like Harry Potter, you've got the world's slowest bird delivering the mail in a world where people can teleport at will, which is insane. There are so many flaws that you can break down. I don't know if you've seen the Wizarding World map for Harry Potter, but it's pretty atrocious. It's a bad time. Also, though, cons to magic systems are that it does require a big brain. It requires you to think quite a lot to figure out all these rules, and so it might not suit you as a writer. You might prefer this soft magic system when creating your worlds. You might prefer the narrative over rules and structures and everything else. For example, you wouldn't maybe get a romance writer to write a murder mystery. They require very different kind of parts of your brain to write them, and it might not suit you. Also, I will say with hard magic systems is the more rules you add to the world, the more rigid your world will become and the less flexible it will be in terms of storytelling. You've got to tell your story within your own rules that you've created. When I talk about rules as well, and consistency in a story, it doesn't always have to be realistic. They don't have to be realistic rules or consistencies. A great example is in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where you've got, and this is, it's Brendan Lee Mulligan brought this up at one point, and I had to repeat it. But basically, in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the detective and Roger Rabbit are like handcuffed to each other for quite a while. They're running around, and they can't get free from the other. It's really annoying. Eventually, they find a saw, and the detective throws his arm up on this box and starts to saw with his one free hand to like break the chain between the two of them. And the box is like shaking everywhere. So then Roger Rabbit slips his hand out of the handcuffs, holds the box, so he can finish sawing and hold it steady. And the detective's like, why didn't you do that before? Like, what's the what? And he's like so confused.
Do you mean to tell me that you could have taken your hand out of that cuff at any time?
No, not at any time. Only when it was funny.
And so even in this cartoonish world, there are rules to how these cartoons function. This guy, Roger Rabbit, can only do cartoony things if it's comical. Another point as well I want to touch on in great world building is having exceptions. The best worlds that exist out there, the most best fictional worlds that exist, are full of exceptions. Adding flaws and exceptions makes your world feel less rigid, and also then flipping rules that you establish on their head builds intrigue. You're like, wait, I thought this is how it worked, but now all of a sudden there's this contradictory rule where now it works in a completely different way. A really good example of excellent world building that is full of contradictions in the best way possible, full of exceptions, is Dragon Age. So to sum it up, I mean, there's such big games, there's so much going on, but one major part of Dragon Age is a thing called the Blight. So the Blight, it's this thing where it corrupts people. If you get one who's infected with Blight, if you get their blood or whatever in your mouth, you'll start to turn into this dark, corrupted creature, kind of like demon zombies. You'll turn into a demon zombie of yourself. And so there's and they're kind of like undeadish. So you've got all of these blighted creatures in the world, and they continue coming. There's an endless amount of them. And the Blight is terrifying. It's established in the story that it is uncurable. No one can cure the Blight, and that's why it's such a big threat to the world. And so you have to create these very particular soldiers who could fight against the Blight. Amazing story. However, despite this one hard rule in the story, in the very first game, when you join the Grey Wardens, there's this one random guy who has a bunch of Mumbari. Mumbari, as you see, dogs. One of his Mumbari are sick. One random guy at the very start of the game, he's got a sick Mumbari who has the Blight. And he's like, hey, can you help me fix up my dog? Fix this uncurable illness, basically. And he tells you about this one flower called Andraste's Grace, which looks exactly like every other single flower in the game. However, he knows where one exists, and you go and pick this flower, and he makes up a potion or tonic or whatever, and he heals his dog with it. Somehow, this one dude in the vast, vast world of Dragon Age knows a cure for the Blight, and just doesn't tell anyone. But that is so true to our own world. One good example of this is I live in Finland now. I'm from Ireland originally, and there's a new system that's come into Ireland. If anyone lives in Ireland, or if there's anyone else around the world who is being introduced this recycling bottle system. Basically, you put your bottles in a machine and it scans your bottle and it gives you back money for recycling your bottles. It's a really handy system, and it's nice to see it's been implemented into Ireland recently. Finland's been doing that for about 20 years. And there's so many things here in Finland, which is why I've kind of moved here, but also because my partner, she lives here too. But also, Finland is just such an impressive country. And all the countries in Scandinavia kind of do this. They just do things so right, and you wonder why the rest of the world isn't doing what they're doing. It just makes so much sense. But that is life. That is our world that we live in. It's varied, it's beautiful, it's tragic, it's all of these things. And it's full of contradictions. Another example is the classic "there's no lonely mountains in geography" rule. So that's a really big thing. So the lonely mountain in Lord of the Rings technically shouldn't exist. Mountains typically form in mountain ranges, due to like the way tectonic plates work and separate and come together. That's how mountains are typically formed. So you don't usually get lonely mountains. However, my brother was in Iceland recently, and he went to visit a thing called Church Mountain, which is this massive isolated mountain. And basically, while there was massive glaciers moving through Iceland, it pushed over this whole mountain range, and all the other mountains were made out of a much softer rock. Church Mountain was made out of a super dense, hard rock. And so when the glacier scraped over everything and leveled all the mountains, it left behind Church Mountain, which is a lonely mountain. There's no other mountain ranges. You can see all these pictures that I'll pop up on screen. There's no other mountains really nearby. Probably less mountains than the Lonely Mountain. And so you can rationalize just about anything in your game. Because with the Lonely Mountain in Lord of the Rings, you can say, well, this thing happened, or this glacier came in, or maybe there was a big, massive geyser that formed of lava that shot up and cooled in just one spot. You can rationalize things in many, many different ways to make it make sense in your world. However, I believe that rationalization is the killer of magic and wonder. The more you rationalize something, the less mysterious and wonderful and fantastic it is. I would go against always explaining how things work in your world, or why things are the way they are, and leave things to mystery and to your audience's imagination. An example of this is if you try to rationalize the designs for the dragons in How to Train Your Dragon. They wouldn't make any sense at all. You'd have a very hard time trying to rationalize that, and you'd probably end up with some sort of compromise, and they would just all kind of look more similar to each other. Whereas this is Meatlug, and Meatlug has a freaking amazing design. However, Meatlug has very, very tiny wings, and I was curious as well, like just proportionally here. This doesn't make any sense with the size of the wings and the size of the body. This thing shouldn't fly. But I was like, well, how heavy is Meatlug? Just out of curiosity. Meatlug weighs 2.5 tons, and their wingspan is only about 18 feet. But also, Meatlug can carry massive ass Vikings on their back too. This is phenomenal, and it defies physics entirely. But it's a brilliant design. Look at this design. Look how cute can't say Meatlug. Look how cute Meatlug is. Like, if you were to rationalize Meatlug, you would have something a little more boring, I think, design-wise. Also, look at bees. I know how bees work. It's more like they're swimming through the air. But for a very long time, the way bees could fly was a bit of a miracle. They have a massive body, tiny wings. Doesn't make any sense how they can fly, and it's beautiful. So when you're coming up with ideas for your world, go big or go home. Just go for the most creative thing you can think of. Think of what will be impactful and what will be memorable. I watched Dune 2 recently, and the thing about Dune, especially the movies actually, is they have such good world building, and everything feels so grounded that when something totally unrealistic happens in the movie, you just believe it. You don't question it when it comes on screen, because everything else is so well grounded. If you can ground your world with very solid rules, you can create some amazing things and constantly sweep your audience off their feet. The sandworms in Dune make no sense. That food chain is f***ed. The size of the sandworms and the other compared to the other creatures that exist, the sandworms would have cleared out every other creature that exists on the planet, or they would just all be dead as well because they can't get enough nutrients. The sandworms make no sense in Dune. I'm sure you can rationalize them. However, when the sandworms come on screen in Dune and it takes up the entirety of the cinema screen, you're not thinking, actually, this doesn't make any sense. This thing is way too big. No, you look at that worm in Sand Dune and you're like, fuck, that's cool. That is freaking cool. I have not forgotten the chills and the goosebumps I got when I saw the sandworm for the very first time. So like I said, go big or go home. Think of what will be memorable and impactful for your audience. And like I mentioned, the world of Dune is so well grounded that it allows the writer to put things in like giant sandworms, and you don't question them because everything else is so well thought out. So if you can ground your audience, you can then sweep them off their feet. And to do that, you need to build a map, build a world, ground your audience in a very believable world. And so in the next video, the next part of this, I will be going into map making, geography, settlement design, all that good stuff to really ground your world, and also how to deliver lore to your audience too, so that you're not just regurgitating a bunch of exposition. So do stick around and check in, subscribe if you want to see that part 2 so you get a notification about it and everything else. Like this video and I'll see you very, very soon. Also, I've done a bunch of other videos. As I mentioned, I've done a video on gods, how to design gods, so if you're interested in that, check that out. Or if you're a big fan of anime and the likes of Jujutsu Kaisen, I've done some cool things for D&D, in particular giving mechanics to different aspects of Jujutsu Kaisen. And maybe there might be some other videos here, I don't know, I might switch them out. But click on one of those, check out other things I've done. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Also, one big thank you to all of my patrons out there who help support me and everything I do. Thank you so, so much. You're just all incredible.